Hi, welcome back, folks. Today's lecture is a continuation of our introductory discussion of English language arts at the secondary level, at the high school level, assessment in particular. Today I want to focus in with you on the subject of rubrics and rubric design. What are rubrics? What's a rubric for? What different kinds of rubrics are there? Why would we use the darn things? You know, when I was a kid, there were no rubrics, okay? It's just like you had a mark, the mark was given to you. Sometimes a teacher would write, questions and comments on there for you. And I don't know. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's just fine. I think, what do you need? But you see, nowadays, the school of thought is that, well, we need a rubric for learning. Because why? Because rubrics help kids understand, what's being expected of them prior to actually even starting the project or starting through the processes or starting, to develop the product or whatever, right? It gives them a kind of a guideline for the different components of their learning that they need to look at. It says something about, the different sorts of things that the teacher is going to be looking for. It breaks things down in a specific way that's ostensibly kind of helpful for students. I don't have a problem with rubrics personally, but I also think that, you can do some damn fine teaching without rubrics. Anyway, you're going to get into a school, and chances are you're going to have rubrics up the yin-yang. So you best learn a little bit about what rubrics look like, what they're good for, what a good rubric is versus a crap one. That's I think, probably the main thing here, right? So when you want to design rubrics, there's typical rubric formats. There's one, probably the one you'll see most commonly is called an analytic rubric. Why is it called an analytic rubric? Well, an analytic rubric is one that breaks a task down into several components, right? So here we have an example of a rubric that talks about information in the communication of information, right? So the criteria are divided into, sharing key points of information, organizing information, and communicating information. And then you can see across the different levels that there's a level for excellence, proficiency, adequacy, and then a limited level, and then an insufficient level. But you can see what an analytic rubric does is it actually breaks down. This is what distinguishes, is that it actually offers different sorts of criteria. All right? There's different sorts of criteria that are given to students, and then they're supposed to think about these different criteria as they craft their final product. Analytics are one sort of rubric. The other kind are called holistic rubrics. So a holistic rubric, just think of whole, right? The whole thing all together, all in one. Whereas an analytic rubric, you different criteria. With a holistic one, you don't get different criteria. You just get the levels of achievement, but you get a holistic kind of a statement of what a paper or what a presentation or what a demonstration of some kind would look like if it were excellent or if it were proficient or if it were adequate. Okay, so it's much more general. I think each of them have their positives and negatives, right? An analytic rubric gives kids more of a specific idea about the sorts of things that they should include. I guess that's helpful as a guide, as a guideline, and if you want to improve, for instance, if you had an analytic rubric that, was for a paper, and part of what you were doing with a paper was looking at ideas or a thesis or something like that, or the development of ideas, or maybe let's say support for ideas versus grammar, right? Or versus structure or something like that. A student might be able to say, yeah, I see my ideas were good, but maybe my grammar sucked or something like that. An analytic rubric points that sort of thing out really well, whereas a holistic rubric not so much. But the holistic rubric, on the other hand, has the virtue of kind of opening things up, right? So maybe where an analytic rubric might close down on creativity, it might close down on variety. It might be very stringent in what's expected. A holistic rubric gives kids a lot more freedom. So if that's what you're looking for in your particular assignment or task or whatever, then maybe a holistic rubric's good for you, right? Here's a sample of a ELA rubric. I've taken this from the Alberta Assessment Consortium, right? So what makes this sample an exemplary rubric? You see what they've done here. They've got the criteria listed along the one side, the left side along the top. They've got the levels of achievement. One thing that they've done here, you'll notice in brackets where the criteria are mentioned. I don't know about in other jurisdictions, but here in Alberta, we've got, the outcomes are all listed in the program of studies, and they're all listed by subject number, right, or by heading number, or by outcome number, 5.1 or 5.21522 or something like that. It sounds almost like a cop stopped you on the side of the road and he's writing you a ticket or something. But in Alberta, it's all of our outcomes, all of our learning objectives are organized that way. So the point is when you make a decent rubric, you want the criteria that you choose to include ought to be distinct from one another along that left-hand margin. You see that each one of those is quite distinct from the other one. And also the criteria ought to link directly to the learner outcomes. Okay? Now another thing that the Alberta Assessment Consortium likes to do is they like to say whenever you develop criteria, they should be articulated as action verbs, not as nouns, right? So here they go: provides information, draws and supports conclusions, communicates, because it's all about action. It's not. So that's one of the things that they say is really, at least aesthetically, it's one of the things that they're looking for in a decent rubric. And then your descriptors too, right? The levels of achievement, you can see that they make sense. That superficial is different than predictable, is different than meaningful, is different than significant. Each one of these levels across in the criteria, you're able to identify the difference, the specific difference between a limited and an adequate and a meaningful, and that in other words, when you make a rubric, look at the cells, look at the information that you include in the cells. If it's not clear to you what the difference is between a 2 and a 3, or a 3 and a 4, you want to look at that. You want to consider that more carefully. And then I don't know. Another thing I guess I would include now, especially if you're a student here in Alberta becoming a teacher. I don't know, like, in the CBE anyway, in Calgary, what they've done, all the schools from elementary up through to junior high have moved to a 4-point scale. The AAC, they love 4-point scales. I don't know why they love 4-point scales. I'm fine with the 5-point scale. I like the 5-point scale, but so now, point being, when you set about to make your own rubrics for your own students, I don't know, you just try to think in terms of the 4-point scale, particularly if you're teaching in, elementary or junior high school. It doesn't matter as much when you're at the high school level, but at the earlier grades, you'll want to move to a 4-point scale with your scoring system. Okay? Scale words. You want to make sure that your scale words talk about the same thing. So, for instance, accurate, logical, partially accurate, and flawed all are related, when you're thinking about analyzing information or data. Insightful, logical, simplistic, unsupported, they're related, right? Or, but if you were to try to say, well, accurate for excellent, relevant for proficient, basic for adequate, and flawed for limited, you could see how these different scalar words don't necessarily map on or align with one another in the same way, right? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the different levels of proficiency or excellence or adequacy using words that are related properly to one another. So you don't want to get a communication scale word confused or conflated with an analysis word or an analyzing information scale word or something like that, right? These little charts from the AAC can help you when you're thinking about, developing your cells, filling in your cells. How do I fill them in properly? This sort of thing. Here's some more examples, right? Scale words you can use for designing or constructing, for organizing or formatting, for developing questions or making predictions, right? These different scale words work for these particular sorts of considerations, but mixing and matching them across the different criteria might confuse things, might not work. Okay? Other ones for drawing conclusions, providing support for opinions. Okay, so just have a look at these sorts of words when you're making your rubrics, and hopefully that will help you make more clear distinctions between levels of accomplishment in your own students' work. Selecting right information, selecting enough information, right? Those are two different sorts of things. The right information, correctness versus sufficiency or having enough information, right? Something that's pertinent isn't the same thing as something that's comprehensive. Do you see? So, if we were to talk about pertinency, relevancy, suitable, trivial, we wouldn't want to mix those particular scale words with the ones, to do with comprehensiveness or thoroughness or something that's cursory or superficial. They don't measure the same sorts of considerations. So don't mix them up. Try to keep them separate when you're developing your own rubrics. I hope this isn't too confusing. And one of the things that the AAC suggests that we do, you can see on this example here, these little asterisks, do you see where insufficiency or limited levels are there? The asterisk identifies, okay, well, if a student scores a 1 or an insufficient, that's a red flag to you that says, okay, well, I shouldn't just leave that kid where he or she is. I'm gonna revisit that. I'm gonna go conference with that student, or maybe I'll give him or her, some kind of a special opportunity to rewrite that or do it again or whatever. That's the idea here. Is that when a student's scoring low like that, that's a red flag for you to help them. Okay, so that's something that you might want to include in your own development of a rubric. Do you see? All right, and here's just an example of an oral presentation, right? A rubric designed to assess oral presentation of a story synopsis. What are you doing as a student? You're synopsizing, you're summarizing a story. What are the sorts of things that I'm looking for as a teacher? Well, how well do you summarize the story? How well do you represent ideas? How well do you retell the story events? How well is it presented orally, right? You're standing up in front of others and you're presenting it. So you can see how what they've done, this particular teacher has done, or he or she has gone back to the program of studies. They've said, okay, well, these are the 4 different criteria that I'm going to use. This is how they're directly related to the program of studies, the objectives there, the learning outcomes. And I'm going to use scalar words that help identify fairly clearly differences in levels of achievement in relation to each one of those criteria, which are bold-faced there. You see that? You can look at that on your own time. Okay, so I mean, you can create rubrics that also have blank cells where you write in the specifics for each case. Now, I mean, I've taken this idea from this lady, Amy Benjamin. I've never used a rubric like this, but it's easy enough to make one. You just have your excellent, proficient, satisfactory, limited, poor. Again, this is a 5-level rubric. Probably nowadays in the CBE, people would be all aghast and say, oh, you have to make it 4. So whatever, make it 4. But you can see, right, the different sorts of criteria here. You've got proofreading. You've got, story narrative. Is it effectively expressed, right? Some ideas about the sorts of things I'm looking for there as examples. You see i.e. What about illustrations, right? Here you're looking for illustrations. So, and then you can write, in point form, what in that particular example made it excellent, when you let it, or what in that particular example made it satisfactory to you. You can, so this isn't, it's not like a prefab, full cell kind of a rubric that I've already shown you. But in a way, this may be more tailored to each particular encounter with the student's writing. You can make decisions and write in your specific ideas about why it's proficient, why it's excellent, why it's satisfactory, why it's limited, why it's poor. And again, here's one. This is the grade 9 narrative essay writing rubric here in Alberta, right? You can create rubrics that have scale criteria already typed into them. So here you've got ones, that lots of times as a teacher you don't have a heck of a lot of control over the sorts of criteria that are, that you're expected to look for, because you're basically teaching to a specific sort of a test, which is an unfortunate set of circumstances, but that's seems to be what matters to governments, is that everybody's learning in the same way at the same time. So you can see here that these cells, and you can read through them. These are all cells filled in by the government, and then what we do as teachers is basically we become technicians, learning what a 9 looks, learning what a 10 looks, learning what a 6 or a 5 or a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1 looks like. And you just get familiar with that through the piles and piles and piles of marking. And lots of times different departments will all mark all at the same time together in a room, and then when there's discrepancies or discussions or indecision, I guess you can fire it off to your buddy and he can look at it, right? Or your colleague, and she can have a go at it. That sort of thing. I mean, thrills and chills, right? You can also see one of the things they've done here too, and this is quite standard too. When the narrative essay rubric, some criteria are weighted twice as much or 1.5 times as much as others. Like content and organization are typically held to be more significant than sentence structure or vocabulary or use of conventions, right? So you can see that you have that power to change the weighting of different levels in the rubric, or rather different criteria in the rubric, sorry. Pitfalls of rubrics. Sometimes you just got too many of the damn things, honestly. You may not need a different rubric for every task. Good rubrics can be used in multiple instances, right? So that one we just looked at, what you're writing in grade 9, you're writing an essay, or you're having the kids craft a narrative or a short story or something. Keep it general, and then it can be used in all of them, and then the kids get used to the sorts of criteria that you're looking for, and a nice general rubric, in other words, right? That can be just as good versus something that's very specific. Sometimes second point is sometimes we tend to make all rubric tasks specific, and they don't have to be that way. If you get too specific, you can shut down on creativity, right? Some rubrics, you'll see teachers using them, includes 5 points, or includes 3 pictures, or why does it need 5 points to be good? Why does it need 3 pictures to be good? Why does it need, what the hell are you doing that for? What's the point of that? Is that just like an arbitrary kind of a judgment that you're imposing upon, maybe you could have something that'd be really great that had like 2 pictures or 1 picture, or even no pictures, right? Sometimes the specificity of a rubric can kind of get in the way of something that could be otherwise really good. But then sometimes they're too general, right? So, like a really general rubric doesn't really provide decent feedback. It doesn't even provide good advice, or not good advice, but it doesn't provide any instruction about what you're looking for either, right? Or it doesn't help kids get started. All right, so something that's too general can just be of no value either. And honestly, some rubrics are so wordy and jargon filled. When that happens most often is when all of us ELA teachers, let's all get together and have a meeting after school because we haven't worked hard enough all day. We'll all spend the next hour and a half after school developing a rubric. Well, then everybody's fingers got to get in the pie. The rubric cells get huge. They get top-heavy. Sometimes they get filled with jargon. These are problems. So keep it simple. Remember, kids are using them. If it's going to be of any value, it should be something that at least kids can sort of understand what the hell you're looking for. Okay? Another point. Important components for English language arts rubrics. One of the things that's really important to ask is, does this student address the task? So, again, those of you who are Alberta student teachers, at the grade 12 level, for instance, you've got the big end of year exams from the province, right? The big end of year student written exams. There's 2 components. One is the personal response, which is, for those of you not from Alberta, it's kind of like, it can be like a story that you write. Or it can be an essay. It can be formal. It can be informal. The critical essay always has to take critical essay form. But when you write a critical essay on an exam, it has to refer to texts that you've studied that year in the classroom, versus the personal response, which has to respond to little snippet kind of texts that the government throws onto the exam at the end of the year that they've never seen before. And point is if you write your critical, but you don't write the critical addressing the texts that you studied in class, or contrarily, if you write your personal and you write it about texts that you studied in class, but you don't reference the texts that appear on the exam booklet, you get a big, fat loser 0 on it. You get an INS or an insufficient. You haven't, in other words, addressed the task. I mean, you could write an amazing essay, but if it doesn't address the task, you get a 0. You get an INS. Or, maybe you write, maybe the question asks you X, but you as a student respond to Y, right? Maybe, anyway, this is one of the things that we always have to consider, and English teachers, we take such time all year long, and there's always one kid in your class who's like, and he doesn't address the task. So this is a big one. That's one of the major things that you have to hit home with students, especially in this era of big high stakes at tests. So I've gone through what an INS is. It's just insufficient. Means it's a special category. It either means that the student has written so little that it's not possible to assess what their thoughts or understanding or their supporting evidence were, or there's no reference to the literature that's studied, right? Or the only literature reference present is to the text provided in the first assignment, or there's no evidence of any attempt to fulfill the task, right? So if you haven't done that, then you just crap out on one of these things. A second thing is development, right? On a rubric, you want to include some consideration of how well are the students' ideas developed, how well are they supported, what details are provided, what references, what proof is given, these sorts of things, right? This is an important criteria to consider when you develop a ELA rubric. And then organization is a different kettle of fish, right? You can have somebody who's got all kinds of great ideas, they've got all kinds of support, but it's almost like, they were carrying it in a big box, and then they fell, and then everything went all over inside the box, and you open the box and it's all mixed up, and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, you get that so much, that kids have good ideas, but everything's out of place. It all needs to be reordered, restructured, resequenced. This is a great task that we have. So when you make a rubric for writing, include a section on organization or structure or something like that, right? Word choice too, right? You assess the work for its diction, style, tone, voice, fluency, vocabulary, language. Does it exhibit control over diction and sentence structure? Is its tone appropriate? Right? If it's a critical essay, is it written in slang? Right? Is it written in a way that lacks objective distance or something like that? Right? Does the work make varied or interesting use of vocabulary? Say if it's some kind of a story. How well is the narrator's voice developed, something like that. Does it have varied sentence beginnings? How skilled is the use of punctuation? Does the student display control of long sentences? Is there parallel structure here? Is appropriate vocabulary evident, right? Are words used effectively? These are the things that we look for in word choice, and word choice can be broken further down into vocab and sentence structure. So, your decision as to how you want to do this. But these are things that you want to consider separate from other considerations. And then conventions too, right? Mechanics, presentation, you can have spelling, punctuation, these sorts of things included, like matters of presentation, right? What about being handed in on time? Now, that one is an interesting one because, it doesn't necessarily appear on the program of studies. So, one of the things that, clever academics and leaders in education now are saying is that you can't, give kids late marks. All right, so but if you can look into the program of studies and you can find an outcome that relates to timeliness or relates to handing things in on time or these sorts of things, you can fold that into your rubric as well. Okay. Some things that the Alberta Assessment Consortium or the AAC says about crap rubric design, is common flaws. One is where, again, I think it's nitpicky, but they like action words, right? Versus nouns. So they think rather than say plan, you say develops a plan. Rather than say content, explains impact of element, right? Or something like that. Anyway, whatever. I mean, if that is, in their view, a better rubric just by changing it into an action word. And another one, okay, talked about this briefly, but like, again, anything that you include on a rubric that has to do with, statements of its criteria, make damn good and sure that you can find evidence for that particular criteria in the program of studies, in the outcomes. So, for instance, you can't, even though I totally get why people give a mark for including their name at the top of the page, you're not supposed to do that, okay? Because you look in the program of studies, it doesn't say anywhere, and, you need to have your name included. It doesn't say that. Or like neatness. You can't do that. Where does it say neatness? Or underlining, right? Where does it say? It doesn't say that. So you can't include that as a specific element on a rubric unless you can find a legitimate reason that is linked to the program of studies. Okay, you get that? Okay, and that's bean counting too. I think this is a legitimate thing. I talked about this, right? Like, why is it important that you have X number of facts or X number of, absence of X number of spelling errors, right? Like, what does that have to do with quality? Why does quantity matter here more than quality? So, when you catch yourself on a rubric bean counting, red flag it for yourself, say, okay, well, maybe I should retweak that, and just look at it and say, okay, well, if I'm looking for facts, because you could include all kinds of facts, and it could be completely besides the point, right? Facts are whatever. Facts only really matter in as much as they relate to the development of an argument, right? Otherwise, why include them? Same with spelling errors, right? Like, some spelling errors are little teeny things that don't get in the way of the meaning. Other ones, are crazy and really bad. So when you make your rubrics, try to keep that in mind, okay? That's more important. And then, there's some examples here of using absolutes. Avoid absolutes like all or none, all right? They say, well, use consistently, frequently, occasionally, something like that. Descriptors that do not delineate discrete levels of quality, right? These sorts of things. Just keep these sorts of things in mind when you are developing your own rubrics for your own students. All right. Using descriptors across the row that do not describe the same characteristic. I've already talked about this with you, right? Precise, substantial, partially correct, superficial, right? They refer to multiple characteristics here, versus in-depth, substantial, cursory, and incomplete. Here, at first glance, the commentary goes, the language of the descriptors seems reasonable, but on closer examination, it becomes apparent that descriptors are talking about different characteristics of the work as opposed to different levels of quality. So in the flawed example, the descriptor for excellent refers to appropriateness of the response. The descriptor for proficient refers to comprehensiveness of response. The descriptor for adequate refers to accuracy See, these are all slightly different elements. So just be careful about how you're formulating, articulating your own scalar words. That's why, earlier on in this presentation I was saying maybe the charts that I've embedded in this PowerPoint for you can be of some value to get you thinking about trying to be consistent across the different levels of achievement. So I used to teach at SAIT, and I like teaching at SAIT, and I think SAIT's an amazing school. But, maybe sometimes, the assessment tools that I was offered weren't the best, but I had to use them because they were the ones that everybody used, and when in Rome, right? But, here's an example. One is a draft. In a communications, in a business communications course, they had this assignment where they had to make up a draft of their feasibility study, and then they had a final copy of the feasibility study for their business that they were thinking about. This business plan, the draft, if you look at this example of it, it's all or nothing, right? So in your introduction, if you make any mistake to do with the introduction, you lose all the marks for the introduction. Same with the discussion, the body, same with the conclusion, same with the recommendations, same with the format. All this, like if you make a single mistake, you don't get the mark for that particular item, which really is kind of insane because it's a draft copy, I had a serious problem with that. I had to tweak that around. I didn't think it was a very good assessment practice at all. But, versus the final copy assessment, you can see how the people who developed that kind of thought a little bit more carefully about, what weighting should we attach to each one of the elements of a feasibility study. I thought that was a more balanced assessment, but especially for a draft, I didn't understand why it seemed so draconian to mark so insane, like so strictly a draft. The idea of on a draft is you make mistakes. Me, the teacher, I go through it, review it with you, offer you some comments, you fix it up, you hand it back, you feedback, whatever, right? And then you do your final copy, and it's so much better, and everybody's happy and has learned something. So just be careful. Like when you enter into processes like this, and you want to see, you want to have checkpoints at which you look for student achievement, and that make sure that they're fair, that they're accurate, that they do the things that you want them to do. Okay. Here's a big map of rubrics and the government mandated rubrics in Alberta, all across Alberta, at the grade 9 and grade 12 levels. So basically in high school, there's two big rubrics that you use in grade 9. One is the functional writing or the letter writing rubric. The other is the narrative or essay writing rubric. Honestly, I think these things are going to go the way of the dodo now. They've changed. In Alberta, they've changed from an end-of-the-year provincial achievement test, or a PAT, to what they call an SLA, which is a student learning assessment, which is supposed to be administered at the beginning of the year, and that's supposed to become a formative tool. I think even the functional writing rubric or the functional letter writing is probably going to go the way, because nobody even writes letters anymore. The other two, however, the 30-2, which is non-academic English in Alberta, and the 30-1, which is academic English in Alberta, I think these things are going to stick around. They've gone from a 50% weighting to a 30% weighting now, which is probably a really good thing. But, these are the sorts of rubrics. We don't, as teachers, we don't have any say over these things. We use these things. We shut our mouths and we use them, and we learn how to. The point here is to use them, learn how to use them accurately, as teachers, and then also teach the students how to write, so that their writing somehow reflects the sorts of things that the government expects us to be able to have our students do in relation to these rubrics, which is kind of ridiculous, because what ends up happening is that these rubrics now replace us ever paying attention to the outcomes on the damn program of studies. Do you see? This is one thing that I don't know why it's not more on the radar, but why isn't it that one of the dangers of a rubric is that it takes the place of actually ever paying attention to the program of studies. Okay? If kids can fare well on these rubrics, if they can fare well on their end-of-year exams, why the hell do I have to ever look at the program of studies? So that's the danger, but that's where we're at in education. Now, that being said, those are the government rubrics, but I haven't always used the government rubrics. You don't have to necessarily. People kind of look at you funny when you don't, but and some English departments are more anal that way than others and more power hungry. But really, suppose that what you want to do with your students is teach them how to write a more aggressively, or no, that's not the right word. Say you want to teach them to write a better academic, argumentative paper, like a real one, that isn't beholden to these canned kind of end-of-year provincial achievement tests at the grade 12 level, right? Those things are fine for high school, but when you get out of high school, they're going to do you absolutely zero good. When you get into university or college, people are going to expect to see a different sort of a thing. So here's a rubric that I developed that I used to use frequently with students, right? You could see how I've weighted it differently, right? The government rubrics, there's no mention of bibliographies or citation. This one I include a section on citation, right? This one I include more concern for different elements of argument, right? Are arguments sound? Are arguments, are the various premises relevant? Are the arguments given or the evidence provided, is it sufficient, right? These sorts of things don't really show up nearly as clearly on the government rubric as they do in a rubric that I can design on my own as a teacher. You'll find the same thing, right? You want to highlight different elements or different aspects of thinking, different aspects of knowledge, different aspects of skill. Make your own damn rubric and use it. Again, sometimes you're going to get pushback from a department head or people who have been there longer than you. You can lots of times just smile and wave. But just never forget to keep your critical eye. Ask yourself, is this a good rubric? Does it do what I'm expecting it to do? Is it linked to the program of studies? That sort of thing. All right, and so here's an example, right? There's on the left-hand side, you've got the government-mandated functional writing rubric for grade 9. It's kind of wordy, it's big, it's top-heavy like that. When I was teaching kids, first off, at the beginning of the year, about, letter writing form, I just basically wanted them to get, because, when I was a kid, you learn how to write a letter, because we still wrote letters, and you still used a stamp, and everybody still actually used their hands on real lined paper to write something as opposed to typing it. We learned how to make a letter. We learned how to write these things. These things still mattered. Kids do not write letters anymore, ever, except in school, right? So I wanted to show them the basic form. What I did on the right-hand side was I made a nice, simple letter writing rubric that focused more on just the way that these letters look. If you stand back 10 feet away from them, you can look at it. Maybe you can't even read the script on them. You can say, that's a letter, and you can see, right? So I would start with the sort of rubric that you see on the right-hand side, which is one that I just created myself. And then after they got the hang of what they're supposed to generally look like, then I'd use the government one. Okay, so, whether you want to do that or whether you don't, it's up to you. And then other examples, right? More specific sorts of writing tasks. I have the kids write a children's story. I got a rubric for it, right? I've got one where I did a comparative analysis between the Epic of Gilgamesh and children's story versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. They have to do comparisons, like text-to-text comparisons. Different kind of a rubric there, right? Or, you're doing citizen participation letters. You're writing to your MLA about some stupid thing that's going on, right? Or trying to do something that's more an authentic form of writing than just a canned assignment in lieu of a upcoming exam, right? Different kind of a rubric. And they're smaller. We read Frankenstein, so I wanted the kids to read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but then I wanted them to look at secondary texts and text based on that, right? Something like text to text again, or movie reviews, right? Movie review of Romeo and Juliet, right? Or looking at daily responses to different short stories that we may have read, right? You're doing a summary, you're looking up words, you're doing some analysis of themes or questions or big ideas, right? I want to see each one of those things each day from you as a student. If you don't do that, I'm holding you accountable by your marks. Here's the rubric. It's fair. You expect. Don't tell me that you didn't know you were supposed to because it's in the rubric, right? Different kinds of rubrics for different specific tasks. Why not? Journal assessments, right? Suppose you're doing, you want the kids to be writing journals. You can set it up. This is one that I just took right from Alberta Learning. But, you can see the handy thing here is they've got a column for the student to make his own self-assessment. And then alongside that, you get the teacher's vision, right? Or you get the student's comments and the teacher's comments. So it's really good because then the students see that not all the time when we think about our own achievement do we see ourselves in the same way as others see us. That's an important thing. So this, I think, can be a very valuable evaluation form where you have those parallel points of view and perspectives on the same rubric tool. Okay, you can have a simple rubric like the one on the left, or a more complex one like the one on the right. Again, this is non-academic, grade 10 English, just teaching. They've never done a persuasive essay before, just really basic stuff. But kind of an item that will help. Each one of these is a tool that will help them and guide them in their reading. It tells them or in their writing. It tells them a little bit about what your expectations as a teacher are. Do you want to focus on argumentative structure more than the government rubric does? Then you can develop one that does that better. And you can also design rubrics to help guide research processes and outcomes, right? So here's one for individual research. Here's one. I did one on court party research when I used to teach social studies, or I had the kids doing a study of Africa, whether trade is a better way to help African countries, or aid is a better, so just different specifics that you can embed in there, and then it helps give guidance to the kids when they're developing their product. Now, don't forget that rubrics that assess written products can be formative as well as summative. I mean, this is something that you don't see often. Everybody says, well, rubrics, because there's marks on it, it's all summative. But really, that's horse crap. I mean, you could take a paper in from a student, you can score it, you can put a rubric on the back of it, you can write comments all about it. It's summative at that point, right? You've got the mark, but then when you hand it back to them and you say, okay, well, read this through and make it better and hand it back to me, now it's formative, right? I mean, sometimes we say these things as though it's either black or it's white. It doesn't have to be. A summative assessment can easily be transformed into a formative assessment, just thrown back into the mix and then revisited and fixed and tweaked and improved upon. It's simple, all right? So just remember that, Calvin, for instance, Calvin and Hobbes, hands in his end of the year departmental exam on which he's just completed a personal response and a critical essay. You mark it with the government rubrics, End of story. That's summative. That's a nice, easy way, by the way. At the end of the year, one of the things, exams are horrendous, but one of the things that's nice about exams is they're so easy to mark because you don't have to put comments on them. You just have the rubric sitting beside you as a teacher. You score it. It's done. You can fly through a pile of those in no time flat, right? But when you have to give formative assessment and formative feedback, then it takes a long time, right? You take half an hour, 45 minutes to read a single paper and to mark it up. So anyway, here's an example, right? Calvin hands in a personal response or a critical essay during one of your units. You score it using the government rubric. The rubric shows him basically where he did well and not so well. And you write on his paper, you offer him suggestions, right? You hand this back and see if you can make it better. That's formative. You did the same thing. He might even have written the same paper. You give him a score, but it's just in one you say make it better, and the other one there's no chance for making it better. Okay? Same thing. Another thing you can do, I used to do this, for my formative purposes, is on the back of my my rubrics for my students, I'd put a little key to comments on essays. So, not all the time would I want to write out a full explanation, but I'd have a little key for, POV would mean point of view, right? If your point of view shifts where you move from talking about a he to a you to an I, right? Something like that. Or, if there's a problem with your use of contractions or punctuation, or if you have a run-on sentence, I could use a short form for that. And then if the kids are wondering, well, what the hell does RO mean? They look on the back and say, oh, run-on, oh, right? So this is valuable as well. All right, so that's enough about that for today, I guess. But, it gives you a starting point anyway for your considerations of how to begin, creating rubrics for your students. Thanks for listening.